on to today's webinar, which is about how your organisation can put in place effective plans to achieve its net zero carbon targets. To give us greater insight into this, we're joined by two experts in their fields. So Lee Jackson is the Managing Director at SmartCarbon, and he's passionate about supporting organisations to develop their carbon accounting and reporting to reach their net zero targets. He's also involved in the delivery of the IEMA accredited greenhouse gas accounting training through Northumbria University. Dave Knight is IIE's technical lead and principal sustainability consultant. He works on with a range of organisations in encouraging them in how to manage their carbon and their energy. He is our guru on that topic. He's also an IEMA practitioner and is our lead trainer on both our low carbon links and our IEMA training courses that are delivered by IIE. So I will now hand over to Dave, who will take us through the first part of the presentation. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Camilla. And good afternoon, everybody. From that introduction, really what I just wanted to do within the first part of today was just to sort of take us through, I guess, the basics, the drivers to what is net zero, why is it important, and I guess why we're here today, and then leave Lee to deal with the more complex issues in terms of how we actually approach it. I always just like to summarize, obviously, in terms of net zero, look, the reality is that we are seeing climate change effects happen on the annual basis and only likely to get worse, with reports around sort of limitations and adaptation and just the impact that's likely to have on business, particularly in the longer terms. So, the UK has set in law their goal to become net zero by 2050. And what that basically means is achieving a no net impact on the climate across the value chains. This is the really important part in the change in net zero to any previous carbon reporting program, is to move it away from just the organization individually, but now to actually start to look at the value chain, where those impacts, where your larger proportion of your impacts actually sit in terms of your business activity or services. Now, the only way we can look to achieve net zero is by reducing our emissions as rapidly as possible by 2050, and then balancing any remaining emissions through carbon removal. So achieving a net balance, which is basically what net means when we talk about net zero. So the reality is that we are heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So whilst absolute zero is the goal, and that's where we need to get to across industry, the reality is that the use of fossil fuels and the need for fossil fuels will still exist between now and 2050. So it's not going to be possible to fully reduce carbon emissions to zero. So it's about reducing them as low as we can get, ideally to around 90% by 2050, and then balancing the residual emissions by actually capturing and storing that carbon emissions through a variety of technologies, whether that's natural, tree planting, etc., or whether that's through industry, through direct air capture or CCS, carbon capture and storage technologies as well. Now, the reason why net zero in terms of requirements, so as I said, it's a legally binding target in the UK that we are looking to achieve net zero by 2050, and that is driven by the regulation of the Climate Change Act of 2008. Now, what this basically means is that the UK government has a legally binding target to achieve net zero. The way in which they will do that is through industry. Through the role of legislation, industry-specific mandates and financial incentives, the UK government, through the 5-yearly carbon budgets, will be looking to work with and supporting industry to make these carbon reductions in a variety of methods. So large companies are typically required to report through mandated sustainability frameworks. Also high emission industries are going to look to face decarbonisation mandates. So things like the aviation industry, the automotive industry, and even heavy industries like steel and cement, looking at ways in which they can decarbonise or reduce their carbon emissions through a variety of initiatives and actions and technology changes in order to achieve these net zero emissions. Now, for most SMEs, you're looking to be indirectly affected by this. So the mandate does typically tend to sit against large organizations and high emission organizations. But because net zero is a value chain approach, SMEs that sit within that supply chain will also then be mandated by their clients or customers or stakeholders effectively to start to look at net zero and certainly start to look at carbon reduction in a more meaningful way. So in terms of requirements that we're seeing across organizations, when it comes to sort of mandated reporting, so large organizations are required to report under SECA, Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting. So we're talking organizations over 250 employees or with a turnover of 36 million or a balance sheet of 18 million. You are mandated to report your energy and your carbon performance annually in line with your financial disclosures, as well as your related actions in terms of how you're managing your carbon, and energy performance as well. The idea is just looking to showcase your company's commitments to energy efficiency and carbon reduction, aligning to these mandatory reporting standards. There are a range of other reporting requirements, such as Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, nice mouthful, TCFD, which will be transitions to the IFRS, and then lots of other acronyms I can put out there in terms of these various requirements. The key thing is that we are seeing more and more mandated requirements for large organizations to report their carbon performance as well as their sustainability performance, both nationally and internationally as well. And again, that's a pushing driver for large organizations to start to look at net zero, but also for SMEs within these value chains to do the same. On a more sort of a local level, so in the UK, we have the Procurement Policy Note 0621, which is a public central government commitment. So any organisation within central government applying for a tender of over 5 million has to produce a carbon reduction plan. And that also applies to any organisation working with the NHS with contracts over 10,000 also having to produce this carbon reduction plan. Focusing on scope 1 and 2 emissions, but with some subsets of scope 3. Again, needs to be disclosed annually, as well as targets in terms of your performance and how you're driving down your carbon emissions within that as well. But I'll leave Lee to talk about that in a bit more detail as well. So for many organizations that are starting out, realistically, we're talking about carbon management. So that's what net zero is really about. So it's key for you to understand your scope 1 and 2 emissions and to start to set your baseline. Net zero is a measure of carbon reduction over time. So we're looking to achieve reductions at milestones of 2030, 2040, and 2050 against a set baseline. This is where the Invest in the Environment program is beneficial, or any members who are on today, or any organization wanting to understand what Invest in the Environment do, is we help you create the systems and processes in place to understand your scope 1 and 2, to set your baselines, to help you build those narratives in terms of your roadmaps or your action plans going forward. One key change I always talk about with net zero is to start to now break down your roadmaps into 5-year intervals. So start to look at what you're going to be doing over the next 5 years in terms of how you're looking to decarbonize your organization as you progress forward. Now, always last thing for me, and then I'll hand over to Lee to take you through the sort of ins and outs of all of this, but things always to consider. The challenge when it comes to net zero, particularly because we're now looking at value chain, is the supply chain, the value chain elements to it. So your scope 3, essentially. It's always key to remember that scope 3 is someone else's scope 1 and 2. So as part of the narrative is about working with your suppliers, with your key suppliers, to help them understand their scope 1 and 2 and to then start making meaningful carbon reductions that will help to support your scope 3 performance. It is about being pragmatic in this. It's about prioritizing your efforts to work with key suppliers, high impact suppliers, opportunities for you to decarbonize the relationships that are meaningful to you. It's also a case of understanding that decarbonization is looking at abatement of fossil fuels. So the key way to decarbonize is to effectively trying to free ourselves from the use of fossil fuels, moving towards alternatives, whether that is through sustainable fuels, through electrification, or through alternatives to effectively free ourselves and decouple ourselves from fossil fuels. It's always important to understand that it's not energy management is about energy optimization. It's about reducing the energy requirements as best as we can, but always understanding that energy is going to be necessary for all organizations. So decarbonization and energy management sit hand in hand. And that's where, again, by having a good management system in terms of how we manage our energy and how we can become more efficient within that, will help to support our decarbonization efforts. But when it comes to carbon reduction, it's just about building a narrative in terms of where you are presently, where you're aiming to be, and what you're doing in the interim. Because that's really what customers and clients are looking for, to understand what you are doing as an organization and to be aware and feel confident that they're in safe hands, that you're managing their scope 3 in line to their scope 1 and 2 or their net zero agenda as well. Final point for me, when we start to think about the transition from where we are to what a net zero future looks like, as part of the financial models that come to sit into that, we have to start to move away from cost to value, to understand that net zero is a value add, a value proposition for all organizations. So we have to start to understand what is the cost of doing something to actually what is the value of doing something when we start to look at our decarbonisation roadmaps and action plans as well. So that's it from me. From now, I'm going to hand over to Lee. So I'll stop sharing, Lee, if you wish to take over.
Thanks, David. Good afternoon, everybody. So my name's Lee Jackson. I'm the Managing Director at SmartCarbon. What I want to cover is, first of all, how we report net zero, and then secondly, how we go about putting a net zero, effectively a decarbonisation plan in place. Before I do that, a very quick brief introduction to SmartCarbon. Our purpose is to help organisations get on track for net zero by 2050 latest, and I say latest, that's our, as David referenced, our legal obligation in the UK, but we work with many organisations who have greater ambition than that and look to decarbonise earlier. We help organisations get there. I will come back to TRACK, by the way, that's clearly an acronym and I'll come back to it. We provide 3 services. One is a greenhouse gas accounting course through Northumbria University, which we run on a monthly basis, and we also run that bespoke to organisations as well. And then we have 2 co-joined services. One is we have our own reporting platform, which allows organisations to report right across the value chain and link in their suppliers, which I'll come back to. And then, and akin to our training background, we also provide support to organisations, because when people first step into, in particular, Scope 3, they're looking for some guidance as well alongside the technology. But certainly what we aim to do is for organisations to be confident in reporting by the 2nd year, and to be able to do so, if you like, without investing in that in-person guidance. So alongside that, and to help that along, we have our own 5-step program, and so we provide these awards, starting off with people becoming qualified through that training, then putting in place a report that covers all the material areas of Scope 3, then putting in place a plan, actually reducing and getting to a point where those reductions are really at a point of climate leadership. So that's just a brief introduction to SmartCarbon. Let me move on to, actually, before I do move on, there's a reminder here for me. A couple of weeks ago, the SmartCarbon team went and listened to Professor Mike Berners-Lee, and I kind of promised myself that I would keep reminding myself whenever I provided a presentation of the reality. And so in terms of why do we need to get to net zero, well, the reality is that for all of our efforts, all the Paris progress and all the COPs to date, we haven't made a dent so far in the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And so if you look at the top of that graph, you'll see it's up to about 2023. And we're not reversing from the problem, we are accelerating into it by having more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and therefore increasing the ongoing levels of warming. And so the goals that we're striving for through those net zero targets are to bring the temperature down to ideally below 1.5, and if not, then below 2 degrees. But as we can see here, albeit on a very temporary basis, but at the beginning of this year, we actually breached 1.5 and got as high as 1.75 for a month. So it's just a reminder that as we're hearing more and more narrative about whether we're trying to do net zero too quickly, we can't do it quickly enough. So the process really starts with reporting net zero. I know David covered much of this, but I want to focus on a couple of things. One is the net zero standard, which was put in place through the Science Based Targets Initiative, was very, very helpful in clarifying what we mean by net zero. And that means reducing by 90% and only offsetting through removal projects the final 10%. But also, and critical, is that second statement there in blue, which is that it includes Scope 1 and 2 emissions, Scope 1 being your direct emissions, Scope 2 largely electricity, but essentially Scope 3 being all those emissions that happen through your supply chain. And the reason for that is that, and as carbon accountants, we're really clear on this, that a carbon footprint of an organization cannot be a true footprint unless it includes all of those indirect emissions. This is the definition in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it's the total set of emissions. So that includes any methane, nitrous oxide, all those greenhouse gases, which basically have global warming potential. And the important thing here is where it says directly or indirectly. And for the people on this call, we're measuring an organisation, but the example in the bottom right there is Glastonbury. Clearly, you ask yourself the question, you were to provide a footprint of Glastonbury and you only included the emissions from the tractors and the farmhouse, those activities, would that truly be a footprint of Glastonbury? Clearly, in order to show the impact of your activities, then that would need to include all of those 250,000 people travelling across the country as well. Probably an even better example here of why we have to report the full value chain is the example here of an electric bus. Now, ultimately, and I'll come back to this on the next slide, that electric bus is going to reduce emissions in the longer term. But actually, in order to show the real impact, if you are the bus manufacturer or the bus operator, then we have to recognise the emissions that will take place in the manufacture of the bus. And on the left there, you have a copper mine, taking into account that just for the motor alone in that electric bus, you will need to mine in the region of 400 tonnes of rock, which will have a small concentration of copper, now less than 0.5%. And therefore, in the bottom left there, you can see the kind of equipment that we'll need in order to mine that copper and then process the copper in order to be able to put it into the motor. And therefore, that has to be included in the report. And so if we look at the scopes here, in yellow, you can see the bus manufacturer. And over there on the left, you'll see that those emissions for the raw materials, the processing, are all reported and need to be reported by that bus manufacturer in terms of their purchased goods. Ultimately, where they get the benefit, because they are manufacturing an EV bus, if you like, is over there on the right, because if we're going to show the overall emissions and impact of manufacturing that bus, then we have to include what the emissions will be downstream in terms of use of that sold product. Now, if they were manufacturing a bus with an internal combustion engine, then there in use of sold products, the emissions in the lifetime of use of that bus would include the burning, the combustion of that diesel over its lifetime. And therefore, we would expect to see a massive reduction there in the area of use of sold products. Equally, if you're the bus operator, then you would report the emissions from the manufacturer of the bus, still more than likely in capital goods, because it will have been a capitalized area of expenditure, and that where the reduction would take place for the bus operator is in their direct emissions, because of course they will be operating that bus going forward. And so that's where it's critical how it flows through across the upstream and downstream emissions for those organizations. Now, what helps in all of this, and I'll come back now to that acronym of TRACK, is because, of course, the question is, well, if I've got to report the emissions from literally mining the materials for the goods, for the laptops that we use in our operation, where do we start? And where the Greenhouse Gas Protocol really helps here is through what we call the TRACK principles. These are the 5 principles the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So you're marrying that transparency, relevance, accuracy, completeness, and consistency. And back to the Glastonbury example, if you're going to provide a footprint that is relevant for that event, then you're going and provide a complete footprint for that event, then there will need to be some trade-off in accuracy, and that is where the transparency comes in, because you need to be clear in the narrative what estimations you've been able to deploy in order to provide that complete footprint. And ultimately, the way this works from an accounting point of view is that if you look at the bottom of this slide, you will see that it is acceptable within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard to begin your reporting journey on an expenditure-based method of reporting. So you may report those materials, those goods that you've purchased to build the bus, if you like, using a spend-based method. In other words, how much you've spent on those type of goods. And then you would be really clear in the reporting in stating that that's how you've measured it and what your plans are to improve. And then you move up the hierarchy in terms of using an average data method for those kind of materials. There are emissions factors which are built into our platform so that you could measure that copper, if you like, based on the weight of copper that being utilized in the making of the bus. Then as we move up the value chain, you then go to your supply chain and ask your supplier to report in the emissions specific to the product that you've actually bought from them. And we've got that baked into our platform so that for all of the subcategories of scope 3, but in particular the supply chain, you're able to move up that journey. So you're able to start off with that expenditure-based reporting that allows you to provide an early net zero report and then move up and task your supply chain with reporting into you. And from a SmartCarbon perspective, we have three reporting options, so that large businesses that have already done this can report in via a free template. We've got a prescriptive, very prescriptive type of platform that SMEs can use to report into you, and then we have the SmartCarbon platform itself. So it's helping suppliers of all shapes and sizes be able to report into their client their footprint. And ultimately, once you've taken that track approach and you've reported all the areas of activity that are material to you in scope 3, you will end up with a footprint, and you will have a clear understanding of where the areas of emissions are across your activities that you need to decarbonize. And so that then enables you to move on to that net zero planning exercise. And here you have, in the challenge that you've had with scope 3 in terms of how do I measure all of this stuff, then it's kind of, well, how can we be net zero? Now David's already covered this, so you follow this hierarchy in terms of, it starts off with eliminating what can we eliminate from what we do that is carbon intensive, and probably the next two are co-joined in terms of, well, there's going to be quite a bit of stuff that we can't eliminate, but actually what can we reduce in frequency, and what can we substitute with low or zero emissions energy or materials. So you're moving away from, as David referenced, you're moving away from those kind of fossil fuel driven energy to electrified and increasingly decarbonized energy to power your activities. And then finally, you would what we can't decarbonize, of course, we compensate through offsets, and that's the hierarchy that we're working to. Now, what helps in all of this is that ultimately, from a UK perspective, we're talking about moving to decarbonised energy. So if we look at the 2023 mix in the UK, you will see over there in the green boxes that the majority of energy still that utilised in powering the UK came from fossil fuels, from natural gas, from petrol and diesel there in the bottom left, and then electricity, with the majority of that electricity, or a good amount of that electricity, but again being kind of powered by natural gas. Interestingly, over on the right, which shows you how we then use that energy, you can see that almost all transportation is being powered by fossil fuels, and that's why over the last kind of 20 years we've made no real progress in decarbonising transport. But here, if you like, is the gift in terms of net zero planning. This is what the energy scenario looks like for the UK getting to a net zero point by 2050. And so the plan is, and you can see that at the top and bottom, the use of natural gas and the use of other fossil fuels has been massively diminished. And actually, most of our activities, the vast majority of our activities are being electrified. That's where most of the energy source is coming from. And if you then track across to the right and say, well, how are we using that electrical energy? You'll see that, you know, the majority of our industrial processes are being electrified, the majority of our home energy is being electrified, and almost all of transportation there is being electrified by 2050. And therefore, the task for you as an organization is to say, in looking at that, how can we make the best of that decarbonisation journey within the UK? And then on top of that, what can we do ourselves? So in the example that I've given here, as you go down that net zero plan that you'll see roughly between 22 and 24, there's a plan there for this organisation to move on to green energy. And then at 2029, and this could be an organisation who have a fleet of vehicles, and maybe they were coming to the end of their lease, and therefore they have planned for a move in 2029 and a reduction in emissions by moving to electrified transport. And then I give an example here at 2038, whereby if this is an organisation that's in construction, it may well be that they are expecting by that point in time that they will be able to move to more decarbonised building materials such as cement. So ultimately, what you are doing in putting a net zero plan in place is, if you like, putting reductions in place with when you expect the necessary decarbonised options to come along to be able to get to that end point. Here's an example of an organisation that we worked with very recently, and I think is a real kind of good example of how quickly you can go from a measurement to a net zero plan. This organisation have been through that entire process. They invested in a bespoke accredited training session for all of their senior team back in September. They then completed the reporting right across their value chain, and actually in their case they were able to go right to the top of the reporting hierarchy because they didn't have that many suppliers, and tasked those suppliers with actually reporting in the emissions for the actual glass manufacturer. And they have recently had their net zero plan validated by Science Based Targets Initiative just last month. So a really good example there of an SME that have done this. And so ultimately, where we want to get to is that you pull together the report that you have on your left. You have that clear understanding of where all the hotspots are, and you combine your net zero plan with what you can do yourselves and how, if you like, you can hitch a ride onto the UK's national decarbonisation plans. And we spend a good deal of our time now helping organisations understand that and put in place plans that meet the requirements of that science-based targets requirements. So good to answer any questions that come along from that.
Thank you, Lee. Do you want to stop sharing your screen, and that will bring us up? One question that is for both you and Dave, I think, is that when it's about baselines, because certainly when you're starting out on your environmental journey as an organisation, getting to grips with the whole topic of net zero is complicated, and so of course you start with your scope 1 and 2 and a bit of scope 3 reporting, which is very much what the IIE programme directs people to. But then when you get further, and you sort of like to think that that's your baseline, and then you get further into your kind of scope 3 investigations, and of course what would look like a nice baseline is now gone all jaggledy because you've kind of added loads more into it, and in fact it's grown enormously. How do organisations deal with that shifting baseline?
So I mean, well, I was going to say, so scope 1 and 2 has to stay static. So whatever you set your threshold as to, or scope 1 and 2 baseline must stay the same and must be aligned. For scope 3, again, this is using the SB Science-Based Target Initiative's guidance in terms of targeting. There is an allowance for the year of baseline to adjust and shift according to accuracy of data. So where you're using estimated information and then you start to get more accurate information, you can look to shift baselines, and that's kind of considered. Whether that will change in time as such, but yeah, so when it comes to scope 3 at the moment, there's a allowance for staggering in that baseline based on information, but scope 1 and 2 ideally needs to be aligned and from the year in which you're considering, unless you know anything differently.
Yeah, no, I think the only thing I would add to that, David, is that I'll give you an example of, there's a good number of local authorities that we have worked with who have started with scope 1 and 2, tiny bit of scope 3, and that's been problematic because, of course, they then have to make known, if you like, to their local population what the new number looks like, and therefore, but the reality is that you are able to restate your baseline and be clear on the fact that the initial measurement in good faith was the direct emissions and the electrical emissions and maybe a little bit of business travel, but then be really clear at a point in time that says this is our scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. And I think there's lots of, the good thing is there are lots of organizations doing that. And for anybody who is at a starting point now, from a smart carbon perspective, we very, very seldom, if ever now, measure anyone's scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, because it makes sense to measure provide your stakeholders from day one really with a picture of what your overall emissions look like, because you're only going to have to go back and do that at some point in time anyway.
Sorry, so just to clarify, you never do just scope 1 and 2. It's always the bigger picture.
Yeah. We screen an organisation's activities, and I think that again back to the greenhouse gas protocol, Camilla. You have got that opportunity to use those expenditure-based measurements. Now, they're broad. They are lacking in accuracy, but at least they present a picture of what the impact of your organisation is, albeit with relatively estimated measurements for some of it. But it allows you to provide a true footprint from it at an early point.
I should say, having looked at been taken through the SmartCarbon calculator again the other day, it makes it so much easier. It de-stresses the whole concept of trying to report your scope 3 emissions by being able to report using your calculator with that expenditure-based data, and then you can, as you say, you kind of refine the accuracy of your reporting as you get to grips with it more, because everybody's on a sort of learning journey, aren't they? Okay, thank you. Now I just want to remind people that if you have a question, please put your hand up, and I'll unmute you so you can ask it. And any question. There's no question that will make you sound silly or whatever. So this is a really great opportunity. You've got Dave and Lee here who are experts, and it's they can give you those nitty-gritty questions that you want to get to. One other conversation, sort of thought that crossed my mind, often crosses my mind when I'm thinking about this, is how we engage people with the whole concept of net zero, because to the general public it doesn't really ring bells, and it doesn't make much difference, and I guess that probably goes for quite a lot of the business sector as well. Have you found any and so when we might have a business that's really keen but it's trying to engage their suppliers and they can't get that engagement, have you found any key sort of drivers or wording or things that help to get that engagement up the supply chain? I suppose losing the contract is one, but
yeah. Do you mind if I go first on this, David? I'll
go
just jump in. So I think a good example of something that's been helpful is the NHS. So they've been really clear for some years in terms of their own net zero targets and the extent to which the supply chain feeds into that. About 60% of 65% of their net zero plan is down to their suppliers, and they've had a roadmap in place for a number of years, and we're now only just under 2 years. So by April 2027, no supplier to the NHS will be able to supply the NHS without having a net zero plan in place. If I take an example of one of the more proactive hospitals, they've got 40% of their supplied goods now being reported through the suppliers reporting in. And so the task over the next kind of just over 18 months, I suppose, maybe 2 years, is to bring that other 6% of expenditure into suppliers stepping in. And so I think, clients organizations having a clear roadmap, communicating that as early as possible with their supply chain helps to bring those suppliers into the fold, no matter what size they are. And then on top of that, one of the things that we've seen from engagement with business, in particular SMEs, is that we then get to speak to, if you like, the senior team, or even, or in some cases, wider team. And it actually then brings the whole issue of net zero more broadly across society into the realm of people who probably wouldn't turn up to a community event. So business is a really essential conduit for, I think, the overall decarbonisation of the nation.
Brilliant. Thank you. Do you want to add anything to that, Dave, or are you?
I mean, to be fair, it is a question I think a lot of organizations are sort of playing with, and scales of organizations would be elements, larger organizations finding it tricky, small organizations finding it almost impossible. I mean, the reality is, as Lee said, it is just about having the conversation. Most businesses aren't inherently looking to not do things if it's not going to be beneficial to them. Some advice I usually give to businesses is, use your peer group, use your sectors. If all organizations are asking suppliers for information, suppliers will start to do it. So if you're within your peer groups and your sectors and you're all asking the same suppliers the same information, well, then that's how you can start to shift things. So, as a mass, as businesses, we have the ability and the power to make the changes that are necessary. Might not necessarily be as quick as we would like it to, but by actually, as Lee said, by making it clear your ambition and what it is that you want to do within your supply chains as early as possible, and getting your peer groups and your other organizations in similar sectors, or having the same conversation, again, that starts to send the right kind of signals that we need through other organizations to just come on board and do the same. The other part is just showing businesses that it's relatively straightforward. I appreciate it doesn't always seem it when you start it, but once you're doing it, it's actually relatively straightforward to calculate a carbon footprint. So it does become an easier process and program. And then again, using simple platforms, easy to access platforms like like SmartCarbon, that kind of thing, again shows suppliers how easy it is to actually engage in the conversation, and just makes this whole thing a more approachable topic as well.
Brilliant. I would just like to sort of reiterate, which we possibly haven't explained terribly well, that SmartCarbon are partners of IIE, and it's a really good place to, once you got to grips with the IIE program and that sort of foundation in place, SmartCarbon can contribute to the your IIE program, but also it just helps develop that scope 3 reporting, and the IIE members get preferential rates when signing up to the SmartCarbon calculator if they come through IIE. So I know that Lee and his team are very keen to do demonstration, happy to talk to anybody further about what the calculator can provide. So if there are members on the call, or any organisation on the call, who would like to understand more about what the calculator does and get a run through, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And for now, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Lee. That was a really quick rattle through, but invaluable, I think, for those who attended.